Okay, hi there, everybody. My name is Johanna Higgs, and I am an anthropologist from Australia and also the director of a very small women's rights organization that I started, which aims at raising awareness about violence and discrimination against women and girls around the world through the documentation of stories and their voices, basically. And so what I wanted to do for today's presentation is just talk a little bit about that and some of the work that I have done and some of the things that I have learned from through that work. So that's what I'm going to start with. But I thought I would give a little bit of background about myself and why I became interested in this topic in the first place. So I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, somewhere that was very safe and also, as I've come to appreciate, very equal between men and women. I never noticed any particular discrimination that was going on. I never really understood that there was any difference between boys and girls. And then when I was 19 years old, I decided that I wanted to travel and I wanted to see the world. And that's pretty much all that I wanted to do. And so that's what I did. And I headed off into the world. And I'm now 35 years old, and my travels have continued almost nonstop in that time period. And one of the things that I began to discover in those travels that have spanned the globe, I've been to all sorts of places, including China and Iran, and small villages in Vanuatu and Indonesia. I've been to Yemen, I've been to Iraq, I've been to Zimbabwe, I've been to Colombia, Kenya, Tanzania, India, all sorts of places, the Solomon Islands. And what I began to learn through those travels was just how pervasive violence and discrimination is against women and girls and how widespread it is. And I began to realize that it was something that was absolutely everywhere. And it didn't seem to matter the culture. It didn't seem to matter, how different people were in their ethnic backgrounds or in their religious beliefs. Groups across the world seem to share this idea that women are somehow substandard to men, and it's therefore okay to be violent towards them, to control them, to not give them equal rights as they give to men, to deny them the same access to school and education as boys might have. It's okay to sexually harass women because they're just sexual objects anyways. It's okay to blame women for rape and other forms of sexual violence that are perpetrated against them because you can't possibly blame or shame a man. And as I began to realize how widespread these ideas are, and of course they exist within a spectrum. There's obviously parts of the world that are much, much better off for women than other places. But nevertheless, these same ideas seem to exist everywhere. And as I began to realize this, I, of course, began to become very, very angry. And it's not fair, and it's not something that any woman or any girl should have to endure anywhere in the world. And so it's from these travels that I really decided that I wanted to do something. And when I began to think, well, what can I do? There are obviously many areas that need to be addressed when it comes to improving the lives and also the rights of women and girls. And that, of course, is giving women and girls more access to education. So, of course, giving girls access to education and women access to higher education. It means improving laws, implementing laws that don't exist to protect women from violence, from sexual harassment, from discrimination, from all these kinds of things. But while I began to realize that all these things are extremely important, there's no point in improving education for girls and women. There's no point in improving laws and getting better justice systems if the people who are giving that education or people who are implementing those laws don't share the view that women and girls deserve to have those rights in the first place. And this has become apparent to me across my work. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well, whether it's girls getting sexually harassed when they're at school, either by teachers or by other students. There's no point in a girl going to school if she's just going to be sexually harassed. And there's no point, I remember a South African friend of mine, she said to me, there's no point, what's the point in getting educated in South Africa? Because when we when we go on to get a job, we just get sexually harassed by our employers. And so while there's a very high prevalence of sexual harassment, and while that's considered acceptable, there's, this makes it very difficult for women and girls to go to school and get educated. Also, when it comes to laws, if the police and all the members of the judiciary, the judges, the lawyers, don't share the view that a woman should be given an equal right in a certain area, then they're not going to implement those laws, even if they exist. And an example of this would be, say, for example, in Iraq, where I was doing some research on honor killings, and it was commonly told to me by other people that I spoke that there were many cases where cases of honor killings were dismissed, or the man who had killed, so it was always a man, a father, a brother, an uncle, whoever it was, would be given a very light sentence and would be let off very easily because the judiciary, the people involved in the case, believed that it was fair and reasonable that he would kill his daughter if she, were to engage in some kind of so-called sexual act or even be suspected of it. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, I was thinking, well, I think what is one of the things that is really, really needed before you can start improving education and before you can start improving access to justice systems and things like this, you need to change attitudes. There needs to be advocacy. There needs to be work done to draw attention to the fact that these things are happening, because there are also a large group of people that don't know and that are unaware of how pervasive and how bad the situation is for women and girls. And also because there are the other group of people who know exactly how bad the situation is for women and girls, but think that it's normal and think that it's acceptable. So there needs to be advocacy done to draw attention to show that these things are happening for those who don't know, and then those who do know, they need to have attention drawn to the voices of those who don't think these things are acceptable and don't want them to continue. And I think that it is when we start to do that, then we can really start to make a change, and we can get proper training of police officers to protect women from domestic violence. We can get laws implemented that stop teachers from harassing students in schools. We can we can do, because people will believe that's right and people will believe that's what needs to be done. And so that's essentially what I have based my work around. And so what I've tried to do is I've traveled to many different parts of the world where I've gone to speak with a variety of women and girls and also men about a variety of issues that are facing women and girls around the world, because not everywhere women and girls are experiencing the same problems. And then I've also done some longer term research projects on things. We did a survey on male attitudes to violence against women. We did a survey on sexual harassment in India. We did another comparative survey for women in Senegal, Belgium, Australia, and Colombia, looking at how they see their access to justice in their countries. And then we did a comparison on that. So we've done a variety of things. And then what I tried to do is take that information and disseminate it in whatever way that I can. So whether that's giving a talk, or whether it's writing articles, or whether it's speaking on the radio, or organizing discussion groups, and then try to bring awareness through that way, which of course is no easy task whatsoever. But in the process of doing that, I've met with women and girls from all over the world. From Colombia, I've met with Syrian women in refugee camps in Lebanon and in Turkey. I've spoken with women in the Maldives, with women in Iraq, and all kinds of women in Iraq, from female soldiers that have been with the Peshmerga to women fleeing from ISIS to Syrian refugees coming over the border into Iraq. There's all kinds of groups of people in Iraq at the moment. I've met with women in Senegal, Mauritania, and so much more. So because I know that I have a relatively brief amount of time, I just wanted to touch quickly on some of the projects that I've done and some of the key themes that came up within those subjects and what the issues were that women and girls were facing. Now, I've mentioned that sexual harassment in schools is is a problem. Now, sexual harassment is obviously a global problem and a massive problem. And I think that now we're in an interesting moment where, at least in certain parts of the world, where that's really starting to emerge, and attention on how bad and how pervasive this issue is starting to emerge. But one phenomenon I came across that seems to be very, very prevalent in Africa, no doubt in other parts of the world as well, but I've heard about the most within Africa, is the sexual harassment of schoolgirls by their teachers. And so I went to Mozambique to learn a bit more about this. And it's actually got a name. They call it sex for grades. And basically, I mean, what this involves is the teacher is asking the schoolgirls, well, saying, if you want to either pass your grade or if you want to get a high grade, then you need to have a sexual relationship with me. And it seems to be incredibly prevalent, and with some of the people that I spoke to, it was just considered a norm. And it seemed to somehow tie in with the whole culture of corruption that seems to be widespread throughout Mozambique and indeed Africa itself, in the sense of, if you want something, then you've got to sort of pay for it. Now, this obviously presents a massive problem for young women going to school in Mozambique, and is obviously a massive violation of girls' rights in this case, because here we're having girls presented with a situation where essentially, in order to become educated, which is obviously a key cornerstone of improving a young woman's life, she's been put in a position where she either has to be a prostitute, or she can look at not passing her grade or doing very badly at school. And this is obviously a severe violation of women's rights right there. And so that was something that I came across in Mozambique. And like I said, I've heard many stories of it from various people talking about this happening through various parts of Africa. The Maldives. Now, I went to the Maldives because I'd become quite interested in the political situation in the Maldives. Maldives is, for everyone who doesn't know, is a very, very small island just off the coast of Sri Lanka. It's a small Islamic nation that has been under autocratic rule for most of its sort of independent life. Though recently had its first transition into democracy with a man called Mohammed Nasheed. And he didn't last too long and was eventually kicked out into a political coup. And the country is said to be slowly declining back into autocratic rule. So I went there with some interest in thinking of, what do women have to say about the situation, and what effects is the political situation having on women. And this is, of course, an essential part of when we talk about women's rights and issues related to violence against women, because the political arena, obviously everything that happens within the terms of laws and governance and rights and human rights and these kinds of things begin, at a government level. And so it's essential that women play a role in governance, which of course they don't for the most part around the world. And women are severely underrepresented around the world when it comes to politics. And they need to be more represented. And their voices need to be louder and they need to be stronger. And so I went to the Maldives to see what women had to say. And though I obviously heard many things over the time that I was there, but the one thing that I found particularly interesting and I'd like to share with you was what women said about, many of the women said to me that they felt that when democracy had come, when they had a democratic government, they felt that their rights were declining. And this confused me, coming from Australia, a Western country where we, implicitly associate democracy with freedom and rights and progression and development and all of these things. And so I was confused. And they explained it like this. They said that it was because with democracy, it comes freedom of speech. And with freedom of speech, anybody can say anything. And so what they explained to me was happening was that because now, before there were limits placed on what could be said in mosques and so forth, but not anymore. And so they said there have been increasingly sort of stronger influences coming in from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And with this was coming much, much more conservative and much, much more strict versions of Islam. And what they were saying, so this was resulting in various imams, going to mosques and preaching these ideas. So what they said they saw happening within their country was a lot of changes for women. So they said, for example, women were increasingly wearing more black, which they did not associate with being Maldivian at all. Maldivian women traditionally wear lots of color. They also never used to cover their hair, and then this was not only were women increasingly having to cover their hair, but the niqab was becoming a lot more prevalent. They spoke about things like not being able to go and get contraception without permission from a male member of the family, or not being able to leave the house and do such things without permission from a male member of their family. Now, all of the women that I personally met on this described that as an infraction of their rights, and they didn't like it, and it was something that they saw was a very negative influence in their country. And so I think that is an example of how the political arena does play an essential role in women's rights, and it does play an essential role in what can lead to a very serious decline of women's rights. So, to go back to the topic of sexual harassment. So I mentioned that I'd been in Turkey and Lebanon. I think there 2 years ago, and I went there to speak with Syrian women that were leaving Syria as a consequence of the civil war that's unfolding there at the moment. Again, over my time in both those countries, I heard a lot of stories, which were of course horrific. But I think the one that bothered me particularly was the way that women spoke of the sexual harassment that they were experiencing. Now, what was explained to me was, in both countries, all the women that I met, was that, I think I will explain it to you through the story of Noor. I think that's better. So I was in Lebanon, and I was in somewhere called the Bekaa Valley, for anyone who knows the geography, and I went to meet a woman in a small refugee camp that was there. And she had fled Syria with her 5 daughters. And their husband had abandoned them and left them in Syria, not wanting, I suppose, the responsibility of taking care of 6 women in a war zone, because sexual violence is so rampant. Indeed, Noor did confirm that this was happening, particularly at the border posts, where she said soldiers were raping the women and the girls. But she said her real problem started when she entered into Lebanon, because she then had the responsibility of taking care of 5 girls in a foreign country with, very little assistance. And so she, like all the other women I met, went out to look for some means of making work. But what she was encountering, as was all of the other women that I was encountering, was sexual harassment. So the employers were saying to them, okay, well, yes, you want a job, okay, but that means you need to engage in a sexual relationship with me. Now, this is obviously an enormous infraction of human rights, of women's rights, and also just, what can I say, a disgusting act of it disgusted me that when I was hearing that men were taking these women's vulnerability to their advantage to try and force them into sexual relationships that they did not want to be in. And so some of the things that were going on was, Noor, for example, engaged in what is known as a temporary marriage. And these are prevalent in some parts of the Islamic world, particularly the Shia, as I've come to understand. And what it means is that, according to Islamic rules, that there's not allowed to be any sexual relationships outside of marriage. So the way that some men get around this is they engage in what they call a temporary marriage. So it means going to an imam and you agree that you will have a 2-month or 3-month period or 6 months or whatever it is. You will be married for that period of time, and then it will be finished. And so it was explained to me that men were coming into Lebanon from other parts of the Gulf and various places to look for young, vulnerable Syrian women to buy. And so that's what Noor had done with her 15-year-old daughter as a way of making some money. I met her daughter because once they'd found out he was beating her, they got her back. But a horrible situation for the women and girls there, and an absolute disgrace on the men in those environments that were doing these things. And I did speak to some of the men about this problem, none of whom seemed particularly concerned. In fact, it seemed like a bit of a joke to them. So I just want to speak, I know I'm running out of time, but just a little bit quickly about Mauritania. There's another country I went to where I did a research project on slavery. Now, slavery, I think most people would associate with either, the transatlantic slave trade or human trafficking, all of course, which are realities. But the slavery system that has existed and supposedly still exists in Mauritania is a little bit different. It's something they call a descent-based slavery system. And so what that means is that if your mother was a slave and that makes you a slave. So you become a slave through a descent system like that, you're born that way. And so in Mauritania, just to give a little bit of context, is very ethnically fragmented, as are many countries within Africa. And so you have what they call the white Moors or the Arabs, and then a variety of different Black African groups. And the white Moors are sort of the politically, culturally dominant ones in the country. And so they are therefore the slave owners. And then the Haratans, there's a group called the Haratans, are the group that they take the slaves from. And so while I was there, I was able to meet with a number of ex-slaves, a number of human rights workers, and also ex-slaves that had organized to try to fight against slavery. Now, slavery is now supposedly abolished in Mauritania, but everybody I met, this is rubbish that it's definitely still going on. Now, this is something that obviously affects men and women, but women, I would argue, are disproportionately affected. Why? Because of rape. And as I was told that, if you're a female slave, then you're going to be raped by your master, as they call it. And I remember I met one woman. She had been a slave, and she said that she had been raped by her master's son, her master's friends. Anybody that wanted her could have her. And I mean, I would hope that it would go without saying to say what an absolute gross violation of women's rights, of human rights this is. And I mean, sometimes I just get lost for words because I'm so disgusted. So I've done a lot of other projects and a lot of other things as well, though I won't have time to talk about them in this particular presentation. Though one thing I would like to point out is that whilst there are women who deal with very specific issues in some parts of the world, such as, for example, in Mauritania, not all women are dealing with slavery, or we might have cases of sexual harassment in school, and not all schoolgirls are dealing with that around the world. However, there are some key themes in all of my travels and all of the work that I have done that seem to be absolutely everywhere. And those are domestic violence. This is everywhere. They're everywhere I go, whether it's physical, emotional, or verbal violence. Domestic violence is everywhere. Sexual harassment, as I've mentioned several times. I think for me personally, this has been one of the most difficult part. For me personally, this has been one of the most difficult things. It's just been pervasive in my life. It's everywhere all the time, and it's something that I think needs immediate attention to bringing to an end. And then sexual violence, of course, or rapes. This is something that happens everywhere, and just blatant discrimination. Blatantly speaking about women as second-class citizens, as not worthy of the same respect as men. And I found there's a bit of a spectrum on this. Not everywhere speaks of women. For example, I've heard men in certain parts of the Middle East and Africa talk of women as literally as objects. They're just like a table, things to be used for men. And then you can go to other parts of the world where it's maybe not that bad, but nevertheless, there's still this idea that men are somehow more capable or somehow more superior, which is, of course, garbage. The lack of laws, as I mentioned, to protect women, or sometimes specific laws that are there to discriminate against women, that specifically stop women from having the same rights as men. But this is also another global problem where there's just not enough laws to protect women from violence, or the prevalence of laws that do specifically allow violence or discrimination to take place against women. Dysfunctional police, and judicial systems that don't work and that don't care about women's rights, that don't think that women's rights are important. This is also something else that I've seen come across everywhere. And of course, the biggest one, would have to be the silence surrounding it all. The absolute silence, this fear of shame, this fear that, you know, if I speak up, I won't be believed, or nobody's going to do anything anyways, or they're going to blame me for what has been done to me. So it's best to just be quiet. And then, of course, what that does is perpetuate the problem and create bigger cycles of violence against women and discrimination, because it creates the two groups of people that I mentioned earlier, the ones that don't know what's going on just simply because they don't hear about it, and then the other group who know what's going on because they see it all around them, but they don't hear anybody complaining about it because of all the silence around it, for the reasons I just mentioned. And so it continues. And so, as a matter of time, I'm going to leave it there. But I think one of the things I would like to end with is just with this question of why. Why is there so much violence and discrimination against women and girls around the world? Why is it in every nook and cranny of this world? Why can you find it in small villages in Mongolia, or in Gabon, or a big city in Argentina, or, you know, in a country town somewhere in France? Like, it's everywhere. Why? All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll look forward to seeing your presentations. Bye.